ladies and gentlemen, furs and furrettes and potential ponies, this is Omega Republic Podcast. But wait, you might be thinking, I am not Ark. Oh no, he's gone. As busy as he is. No, my name is Diamond Heart. I will be your host, kinda, and we have, I would think, very special episode today because, as you might have noticed by that very unique jingle, we have a special guest here today. Gonechoo Gator. He's a comic artist. He's been doing it for quite a while now. He does it in the vein of around the 1940s. I think it would be better if we let him explain. So, Mr. Gator, if you would be so kind as to tell us a little bit about yourself and what your specialty is and your main focus for your work.
Alrighty then. Thank you for having me, by the way. The work in question, Gonechoo, is meant to be an old school style newspaper comic strip back when people actually read newspapers. The premise of it is basically it came from when I was a kid. There was a particular comic that was winding its way down, unknowingly winding its way down because the actual artist in question passed away in 1973 somewhat unexpectedly. But there was a comic strip by the name of Pogo by Walt Kelly, and it took place in sort of this idyllic southern swamp type of setting. And it was popular during the 50s primarily, though it started about 49 and ran till about, as noted, about 1973. In retrospect, after thinking about it, as I got older, I thought that it would be nice to see sort of a revival of it. They did try to revive it back in 1989, I think, without success. But I felt that the reason why it kind of failed as a revival is that what they should have done is kind of explore more of like a next generation kind of theme to it, as opposed to trying to revive the original. It's kind of, if they brought back Star Trek and tried to use the same cast again, it would be quite odd.
It's an old
setting.
Yeah, it's a modern take on a sort of old type of theme of art, isn't it? It's of days gone by. Definitely an old medium. As you said, the 40s, around 40s and 50s, and it was more of a dedicated art, wasn't it?
Yeah, the technology advances, the interest in certain kinds of media tends to fade away. The early days of the internet, around the 90s and probably into the very early 2000s, people would actually go and look at webcomics on a fairly regular basis, but nowadays most people just watch videos or animations, so the webcomics field has kind of dried up a bit. I mean, there's still people out there that are doing webcomics, but it's kind of a fairly contested field for people's interest. But the same thing can be said about newspaper strips. Back in the day, they had a lot more interest and money directed at it, and they were much larger, but they kind of dwindled away during the 60s and 70s. They became small, like a bit of a tribute to that old medium back before it kind of atrophied away. I think the last great hurrah of that media was probably Calvin and Hobbes back in the 90s.
That was rather well known, yeah. That's another thing. That's like another kind of comic you think of when you think of the olden days, isn't it? When was Calvin and Hobbes? Do you know when that was first? Well, not first, like the sort of time frame that it was the most active in, or the most well known.
I think, as far as I know, its heyday was pretty much the early to mid 90s, I think. I mean, it lasted, I think, 10 years, if I recall correctly.
Of course.
Not really certain.
Yes. All right. Well, I'm obviously, as you can tell, I'm not the only one in this podcast. We also have Jerry, who is helping me in this recording. Thankfully, I was hoping I wasn't going to be the only one here. Jerry Husky. We also have Kruger and Meiku, who are going to be joining in, hopefully joining in on the discussions. What was the one thing, that gave you the inspiration, the passion for what you do? Like, a specific example of made you say, this is what I want to do. I want to start making comics like this.
I'd always wanted to make comics, but the problem was I never was particularly good at inking, which is kind of a keystone trait to working in comics. But the thing that actually triggered it, the thing that actually said, okay, this is what I want to do, was a bit of self-reflection on going back to the things that inspired me. And I thought about how sad it was that really you don't see a lot of the sort of golden age funny animal stuff much anymore. I mean, furry stuff is very prevalent and reasonably popular, especially now. The actual stuff from, say, there was a really good strong period up until about 1968. From about the late 40s till about 1968 was the heyday of funny animals comics. In fact, it might be startling to hear this, but at one point in time, there were more funny animals comics than there were superheroes comics.
Oh, wow. That's impressive, really.
Yeah. Yes. Nobody even remembers them now.
Makes me want to have the Iron Fur be reality.
They had all sorts of titles. I mean, like Fox and Crow and Screwball Squirrel, not the same as Screwy Squirrel, by the way. And of course, the founding father of all those Funny Animals comics was, appropriately enough, comic called Animal Comics, which is where Walt Kelly actually cut his teeth after leaving Disney to start drawing a series called, it was originally, I think, named Albert the Alligator, and I believe it eventually became Bumbazine, and then eventually that became Pogo, which is the comic strip. But originally it was a comic book series, which involved this sort of troublesome alligator character who was hassling this little black kid and the various other animals of the swamp. And Kelly, at a certain point during his career, decided that he didn't really want to continue drawing the little black kid for a variety of reasons.
Good reasons.
Yes, awkward reasons, but yes, he kind of took the humans out of the setting and just had nothing but anthropomorphic animal characters. I remember, like, vaguely, just vestigial remembering possibly reading bits and pieces of Pogo as a kid in the newspaper, and then very distinctly remembering when Kelly, like on the news, I remember it was like CBS News, I think Walter Cronkite announced it, that Walt Kelly had passed away back in, I think it was November or October of 73. And I as a kid, I had this very strange kind of way of dealing with it. I was a little sad, but I just kind of assumed that somebody else would come along and do something similar to what he'd done. And just such wonderful, blissful ignorance of the kind of actual loss that we have of talent in the world, that when you actually lose some of these people, there really aren't people who replace them. And some 40 years later, I thought back about it. I started researching Kelly's work and looking at this sort of one-man band who pretty much did everything in this comic, at least initially. He did a lot of stuff and did a lot of very, very lauded line poetry writing stuff, and people loved his comic. He was incredibly popular in the 50s during the McCarthy era. Very valiant man. But anyway, I kind of thought to myself, this guy's work was just amazing, and yet there's nobody really like this. And I don't believe myself to be capable of being as good as this guy based off of his background. But I mean, it's humanly possible with a little bit of experience. I mean, this guy spent 10 years getting to the state where he was producing comic strips that were of that laudable trait. So I thought to myself, this guy's probably a guy I want to model myself after, cartoon-wise. And it's like, I've been wanting to write stories for a long time, but I had that agonizing fear of success that you have where you don't want to screw up the story that you're so treasuring by doing it wrong. And it becomes a real blockade creatively when you're sitting there going like, well, I want to do this, but I don't think I'm talented enough to do it yet. And it finally occurred to me, well, what I need to do is I need to do a journeyman project. I need to do something to sort of cut my teeth on it. And I had worked on previous projects, but they were never artistically projects where I finished everything myself. I worked with a team of people. At one point in time in the late 90s, early 2000s, I worked on a reasonably popular webcomic, but I won't go into what that is because I kind of like the privacy and intrigue that comes from not telling certain things.
Of course.
But I worked with a group of people, and it was relatively well received, but eventually had to be shut down because we didn't know how to get anything published for it, because there was no way to get self-publishing going back then. There was nothing like Lulu back then where you could print color comic books on demand or anything like that. It was much more difficult. Even nowadays, I'm not particularly fond of Lulu because they do black and white comics very, very well, but to really get good quality color comics, I don't think they've nailed down the print on demand very well reasonably. That was the reason why, as I thought, well, I miss this stuff so much. I miss the sort of Funny Animals, sort of proto-Disney-ish, early proto-Disney-ish stuff. I didn't see anybody really doing it the level that I appreciated it at. I mean, there's a lot of near misses, but most people, when they focus on Funny Animals, they're thinking of the stuff from the 50s. Classic Warner Brothers later period Disney stuff, where they really super refined it. But I kind of liked the stuff sort of from that weird period. There's a little period in between the ink spot era, really refined color Disney era of around the late 30s, where they kind of were somewhere in between. The characters kind of still were noodly and super animated and kind of weird, but they were getting color and they were getting... But these guys were still, especially the Disney guys, were really very competitive back then because their bread wasn't buttered yet. They were still fighting, for supremacy against the other animation companies that were out there at the time. But their killing blow was Disney securing the Technicolor contract to be the only company to have 3-strip Technicolor cartoons during I can't remember the exact years, but that was the killing blow, was sort of during that period in the 30s, where they were the only people that were allowed to basically make full color cartoons for about 3 years or so.
Yeah, and
they nailed it. That killed all the competition.
yeah, eventually it Disney turned into the enormous behemoth of a company that it is, and it got so much influence. I mean, you say there's like you've had a whole bunch of near misses what with fan art or fan works that portray the Disney characters and such, but there's a good reason why people want to do it, because as much as Walt Kelly might have had influence on you, the Disney would have had the same effect on them, and they have a good reason for it. It's good art and it's good animation.
It's highly refined, and basically they're well known, whereas most people don't really remember Walt Kelly because he's an esoteric American cartoonist from the newspaper mostly. In fact, I don't think most people realize that Walt Kelly worked for Disney and animated The Reluctant Dragon and bits of Dumbo, at least a couple of the Mickey Mouse cartoon 30s. But there's the Disney strike came along, and he really wasn't actually happy working for Disney that much. I mean, he liked the people there, and he was very, very close friends with Ward Kimball, who was one of the classic 9 old men of Disney. Ward was one of the more renegade, rather a wild thing, sometimes referred to as the ogre there. Kelly and he had a really, really strong friendship. He hated leaving Disney, but he just wasn't happy creatively there. He wanted to express himself more as an individual. And as much as Disney's an awesome place for learning stuff, they do tend to be a cooperative that don't really give the individual artists a name of their own. In fact, it was kind of assumed that you just had a Disney production and you didn't ask who did it. That was the company entity that produced this work. He was very responsible for that very early. I think Kimball even said that it was kind of a pity that Disney didn't draw more from Kelly's style as opposed to trying to get Kelly to draw like everybody else. So he kind of went off on his own to do comic books. I think he secured a job with Dell through the help of his Disney connections. But he didn't leave because of the strike. He left during the strike because that was a good excuse for getting out. He didn't actually want to leave because he wasn't mad at Disney and didn't really had friends on both sides of the pickets. So it wasn't really the reason why he ditched out of Disney. He just wanted to express himself creatively on his own. Very strong-headed individual, I guess.
You obviously do have a very big fondness for art. That goes without saying. Just for curiosity's sake, were you always artistically inclined? Was it something you've been doing for as long as you can remember? Did it start out as a hobby, or did you study it academically, or how did that start out for you? Just your journey to artisticness.
Well, back when I was 12, around 1980, I started to do some doodling, and I drew a lizard-like character. And I realized that at that very moment, this is what I wanted to do with my life. I knew immediately that I wanted to be a cartoonist. And then I slowly worked my way towards forgetting it as high school progressed on. And then I actually got a partial scholarship to an art college, but I simply couldn't afford it. So I ended up moving into computers and I always had a background in computers, but I ended up moving sort of double training in both medicine and computers. I ended up working in radiographic technology and stuff like that, which is still my day job to this point. But I basically ended up not really pursuing a career in art because it wasn't financially viable for me to do so. And I kind of agreed with my parents to some degree that it's an extremely risky, if you're really passionate about something, for goodness sake, do not make it your job.
That's a pretty common phrase I've heard.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because
don't do it.
Then it becomes more of your job and something you have to do for money than something you want to do for your own sake.
I think it actually was the original concept of what an amateur was more like an amateur. It was like doing it for the love of the thing as opposed to doing it for the professional sort of money-based need for it. But the term amateur has kind of fallen on disuse as meaning somebody who's less competent. Really, the original meaning of the word was somebody who really is so passionate about it that they wouldn't do it for money.
Which is definitely a better way of saying it.
Yeah, I mean that's before then, but just I decided not to actually go into art professionally. I mean, I think there was literally a moment in where I almost did do it professionally that I did actually choose to. I would have probably been better off if I'd gone to some place if I'd had the money, I probably would have gone to Cal Arts or something like that instead. I mean, people did think that my work was pretty good. They gave me a scholarship for it, but it
Ooh.
was not a complete scholarship, and it was not enough to pay for the whole college.
I mean,
So,
if they think it's good enough to give you a scholarship, then I mean, it must mean something, right?
unfortunately, I grew up in the South, and my family was not particularly rich, and I only had a certain amount of money I could afford in college, and it was very, very difficult to convince my parents that it would be a smart move to move into a high-risk field like art as a primary form of employment. And I think in retrospect, even though I probably missed out on a lot of contacts and a lot of because it really, to get in the industry, you really do kind of have to go to the right school, meet the right people, or you're kind of battling up a much more difficult path, contact wise. You might be able to get the skills, but it's very, very difficult to meet the right people to say get your cartoons on. The internet was kind of a major changing point there, because all of a sudden anybody could basically put their stuff in front of other people, and that was an amazing thing at the time. It's a little less like that now, sadly, but the idea though was I just decided I would just continue to work in my fields that made reasonable amount of money and didn't impede too much on my time to work on art. And I really hit a sweet spot in that around I think it was about 2.5 years ago is when I started Gonechoo. I've been kind of like sitting there thinking, okay, well, do I have enough time to do stuff? And I thought about it and said, like, there's absolutely no reason, if I didn't throw out everything else in my life other than eating, sleeping, and working, that I couldn't actually do this. And so I dedicated to that. I'd basically finished up a couple of other projects that I was working with other people on that didn't completely pan out. And I said, okay, now I'm looking for my next big thing. And I thought, okay, it's time to do this by myself and take care of this, to actually start a project of my own with nobody else really helping me. And I thought I would like to do something. The best thing to do is to do something you really, really love. I mean, passionate about it. I don't mean passionate in the sense of necessarily like almost convictional kind of passion, but more like this is fun and I'm enjoying it and nobody can stop me kind of. And that's really where you find your strength, is working on something that you really do enjoy and that nobody will dissuade you from doing. And in this case, it was I wanted to draw funny animal critters in the way that they used to, and I enjoyed. And I thought, I'm going to do this, and this is what I was going to do. And I was really intrigued by some kind of weird remix version, kind of a remixed version, mental remixed version of Pogo. Something simple, a couple of characters. That's actually from somebody that was drawing that picture. There's from somebody that was drawing something from in that 1930s style with the sort of Pac-Man pie eyes.
Yeah,
there. I just saw something pop up.
yeah. Copper just posted a picture in the chat that we're in. It's it's a like a 30s style picture of it's a rendition of alligator
I get a very surprisingly large amount of gift art from people about this.
I can tell. I mean,
amazed by the amount of gift
I
art
can
this
tell.
thing gets.
Going on your Tumblr, there's so many different posts where you just getting all sorts of fan renditions of the two characters, and it's
I'm very thankful for that.
definitely heartwarming to see the amount of
Oh,
love people have for what you do.
They're very elemental characters, though, and that's part of the reason why I did this is I wanted to work in characters that were almost like, isn't there something like this somewhere? But there really isn't. There is, but there isn't. Especially the gator, the alligator character, just sort of the basis of the comic. The premise of this comic is it's taking place in 1980. It's a vaguely self-autobiographical, sort of a semi-autobiographical recollection of experiences that I had as a kid, though it's basically painted in a much more fantastical light. And basically it's about this otter kid who wanders into the forest, which he does this a lot because the otter kid basically kind of spends most of his time by himself. And when I say him, it's really not an accurate term. I should say they. Both characters are basically described as they because they're kind of in that same light of cartoon characters that you're not really sure where they're from per se in their stand on things. There's a very old cartoon called Crazy Cat by a man by the name of Harriman. And when he was asked, is Crazy Cat a boy or a girl? He said neither. He said they're sprites. They could either be either or. And I always found that kind of fascinating, the idea that cartoon characters were kind of genderless entities, because it opens up all sorts of interesting questions about human nature and how we react to things. But anyway, the point of the matter is that the otter goes into the forest, this sort of swampy forest, and is accosted by an alligator who apparently wants to eat him, but doesn't really seem to be very good at actually initiating this sort of like predatory response. So the otter just kind of vaguely blows him off. after a couple of misadventures, they kind of become friends, sort of awkward friends, because the gator still wants to eat the main character in question, but isn't really capable of doing it because they're actually way too nice and way too polite about stuff. I was always fascinated by Kelly's original rendition of Albert the alligator because Albert was originally a jerk and a bit of a villain. When he changed into a kind of a nice character, kind of a still occasionally being a vaguely threatening, but not that often. He became a lot cuter. I kind of missed the old die throw, is he a good guy or a bad guy vibe. I really missed that.
Ambiguity, it was like that came with it.
There's this beautiful moment in the original comics where Albert said to himself, I'm tired of being alone, basically. I'm tired of nobody liking me. And he literally went into an emotional crisis where he hated the fact that that nobody liked him. And he literally had like a breakdown over it. And it was one of the most beautiful dynamic moments in cartoon character history where the character flip-flopped, did a heel face turn from being a villain, a sort of fun villain, but still a villain, into being essentially sort of a formed, likable, sidekick to what eventually became sort of the masthead character of Pogo. Even though really it was all about the alligator. It always was about the alligator. It's just that Pogo's such a good neutral character, perhaps a bit milquetoast-ish. So I kind of thought I wanted to do a strip with like a good neutral kind of character, and I thought a good character to do would be an otter, because otters are water-bound. They're reasonable mammals. They're different from I was originally going to do a fox, to be honest with you, but it ended up being I'll do an otter because they have kind of the similar body types. They would live in the same environment. So I did an otter, and then I had the gator. Always a planned gator, but I wasn't really sure about the mammal character. It actually came pretty late to do the otter as the secondary or the sort of support character for the gators.
Oh. All right. Well, you'd obviously been doing. You obviously did. Did you do the, specifically the anthropomorphic style art throughout your time in doing it? Was that a constant thing throughout your time doing art?
I did do some anthro. I didn't actually draw anything mammalian for a very, very long time. I drew a lot of reptile type characters when I was younger. That seemed to be the thing it was always an awkward match being in the furry fandom because really, I didn't draw a single character that was a mammal until well into the 90s. I never really drew anything mammalian until the 90s. It was like that was the first time. But up until then, I drew a lot of weird alien reptile-type characters, and that was it. I even had I remember at one point in time, I had kind of a scornful attitude about everybody draws dogs and cats. Those are for losers kind of attitude about it. I was like, I thought it was a done deal. There was no reason to do them because everyone was drawing bears and kitties and doggies. Who wanted to draw those things? Jeez, it was done to death. Or rabbits or any of those mammal types. I thought reptiles are the place to be, man. That's where all the cool kids are going to be.
Yeah, I'd say it's an underdog species, but
not anymore.
Oh yeah, there's scalies all over the place.
Yeah, I never really had a particularly good, solid bond with the idea of. In fact, I still think that if you look at my artwork, it kind of feels more like the characters that are reptiles are kind of more natural looking, and the mammal characters feel like somebody took a lizard and kind of maybe shaped it a bit with sort of mammal-like traits. It's like how you can see most furry artists that they'll draw dog paws on everything, and know that's what they started with because that's what they draw as the default. They'll I'm drawing a dragon, and I'm looking at it, I'm going, that's a dog.
It's like, scales. I'm drawing a dragon. Oh wait, never mind. I'm drawing a dog. Crap.
Yeah, people like to do hybrids sometimes, even if they don't mean to.
But in my particular case, I feel that it kind of shows in my artwork that it's obvious that I started with reptile-like beings and then slowly branched out to non-reptiles because someone's even pointed out, it's like the otter, is that fur? Are they growing spikes? And I'm going, that's just kind of idealized cartoon fur, the curly spiky fur stuff, very Sonic the Hedgehog-y kind of stuff. But the truth is I really don't know how to draw fur. I mean, I can, as in push to draw fur from realistic representations on photos or references. But when I draw, I don't really think in fur. I think kind of more in the sense of the sort of flat skin style structure stuff. It kind of shows if you look at it in my work. I drew a lot of weird alien stuff too. And occasionally very science fiction-y stuff. My initial work actually is very, very science fiction. Before I drew a lot of funny animal stuff, I drew a lot of science fiction stuff. So it was like this weird transition from drawing cartoonish reptiles and aliens into drawing like much more strictly, less realistic, more fluid things. In fact, that was the biggest help in drawing cartoon characters, was it got you a real good sense of flow. A lot of cartoonists really know how to give good poses. A lot of my earlier work was kind of stiff, but you really learn a sense of flow when you draw cartoons, because you realize that everything they draw is usually based off of some curved shape, a balanced curve of some sort that you usually don't see in real life, because real life things don't quite break up the same way that things in cartoons do. In cartoons, they're very fluid and whip-like, and that's kind of part of what makes them so beautiful and attractive, is just how they seem to follow this sort of natural movement of like fluid-like movement that you don't see much in reality. But you want to learn that so that your poses, when you do draw realistic stuff, don't feel so bizarrely stiff.
Yeah,
the longest time.
Sorry, there's an aspect of like posing and such is an important aspect of animation, isn't it? Because animation, especially like cartoons and such, it's important that the expression comes from the gestures that the characters make, even if they have to be, exaggerated slightly, because there's no sound associated with the picture. It's just a picture. There's no they're not moving. They're not, you can't hear what they're saying. It's just individual panels, and so you have to make sure that the movements and the poses and everything are so clearly put out that it's easy to both notice that they are actually doing that action, and then it's in a way that'll complement the style that you're drawing.
I mean, all animations, the reason why cartoonists draw the way they do is because in most cases, especially in modern cartoons, they're looking to direct the character towards its target anyway. And it's like it's sort of like a premonition or a prelude towards its eventual motion towards its destination, as you want it to seem like it's flowing naturally towards that. So
yeah, so you'd obviously been doing these funny animals for a while. When did you first find out that furries were a thing? That there's this whole massive conglomerate of people who just love these anthropomorphic animals, and are crazy about making art and talking about it, and have all these sayings and the way we do things, and it's so lovely. But at what point did you realize that there was a whole a following of that particular type of theme or art style?
September 2, 1992.
Really?
I would say that's probably, I'm pretty certain that was it. September 2, 1992. It's not like I jotted the date down, but if I recall correctly, on my old account on Furry Muck, that was the first day I logged in, was sometime around that time, 1992. I mean, that was literally I had no idea stuff really existed until that moment. I mean, I was aware of like the original sort of funny animal stuff kind of distantly, in a sort of like, oh, kids watch the, animal cartoon character type thing. But I was not actually aware of the furry fandom in the real sense of it until exactly that time. I had been wandering around I'd always been interested in, being in computers. I was very, very interested in bulletin board systems and stuff like that, where you'd call up and, it'd be like a single site that would collect stuff possibly from other places or from other users. But the very early public internet had come into existence, and there was a library dial-up, and you could occasionally get the library dial-up. It had like fixed sites that you could go see, and obviously Furry Muck was not one of those. That was sort of one of those more cryptic things, but you heard about it you could find out about it by looking at the original Golfer, which was a menu-driven version of the back when it was all text and arrow keys kind of stuff. None of the pictures existed yet, but I'd heard about it because I was always into sort of like the anthropomorphic animal thing, even if just simply from the reptile side of things. But I did draw like stuff like those types of things. And suddenly I realized there's a group of people that play these anthropomorphic animals, and I thought this is kind of cool. I'm going to go check it out. So I read up about it, and eventually figured out how to crash a high telnet prompt to a raw telnet, and I was able to telnet in. Met some people there, and started to hang out, and started to hear about the history of the furry fandom, the early, and at that time I don't think it was even quite solidly referred to as the furry fandom. There was furry muck, which I think kind of was the thing that kind of made it the furry fandom that we recognize now. But before then, it was they kind of referred to it as like, funny animals, and this sort of like new version or more underground version of funny animals.
That underground, that's funny.
Well, the thing is that I think after really researching it and looking at it, I honestly believe that furry fandom is the true inheritor of the original funny animals movement from the 30s and 40s, before the Hays Code kind of crippled the kind of discussion, and the 50s destroyed it. I mean, really, really drove it into the ground with censorship and media control of the subject matter. And it kind of drove the original interested funny animals people kind of underground. And that percolated into stuff like Fritz the Cat in the 70s. And it only really reemerged as sort of a grassroots, sort of under the table movement during the internet age, where people could actually talk about stuff that they normally couldn't publicly discuss. And that kind of gelled the fandom into sort of a group of people with this unified interest. But I actually do believe that furry fandom is the true heir of the funny animals movement, the early funny animals movement, before they started to cut out more adult content. And I don't mean like adult as in like sexual content. I mean like any kind of like stuff that wasn't, any kind of stuff that was directed at a bit more of a thoughtful level. If you look at Ub Iwerks' cartoons, the Flip the Frog cartoons, I mean, you had like a cartoon frog there that would swear and make sexual innuendo jokes. I mean, we're talking 1932 here. We're talking like really back in the day. It's doing stuff that you wouldn't even think that they would do in the 50s. I mean, there was some amazingly mature-oriented humor in the early days before the Hays Code kind of crushed that stuff.
Yeah, Fritz the Cat was an adult cartoon, wasn't it?
Yeah, that was from the 70s. That was like I think that was Bakshi interpreting R. Crumb's character. And R. Crumb was very strongly inspired by Disney, but his stuff was much more sort of grittier and underground kind of things. Apparently, R. Crumb did not like Bakshi's movie very much. So, but yeah, Crumb kind of started the sort of like stuff steeped in the sort of Beat Generation kind of content. I don't know if anybody knows what the Beat Generation is. It was kind of the sort of post-World War II sort of radical precursor to the hippies.
When everything kind of went on an uphill.
Burroughs and William Burroughs and I'm trying to think of the others. I'm not immediately coming to mind, but a lot of these people who had these sort of revolutionary countercultural ideas that involved stuff that nobody had ever really thought about, realized there was something kind of missing from the culture, and they kind of like delved back into the primeval past of humanity.
Yeah, there's going to be some cultures so like, oh, this is not part of the norm, you're an outcast type of deal thing.
The Beat Generation was very, by today's standards, are still kind of amazingly forward-thinking and progressive to almost a bizarre level. They were talking about stuff that people thought was like invented in the 60s, but they actually invented it in the late 40s and 50s. It was much earlier than that. It didn't catch on for a while, but these were like the initial people who were thinking about this stuff. The thing is that the original Funny Animals movement had a lot of that kind of sort of precursor flavor that kind of disappeared in the 50s. I mean, I was reading like an article about that, about the kind of censorship that Disney comics got, like the classics, the kind of censorship they got. They weren't allowed to talk about, they weren't even allowed to depict snakes.
Seriously?
Yes. They could, the ruling was something like, we don't want any stories which are involve sophisticated themes.
Really?
They didn't want characters to fall in love.
Really?
It was frightening. I mean, the kind of suppression that was going on in the 50s and Funny Animals comics is unbelievable. I mean, it's like you just want to go back in time and smack these people. You really do.
I saw this before. It was about the blacklist, pretty much.
It was during the era of McCarthyism, but there was this sort of like
Yeah,
ultra puritanical view of things.
Yeah, the idiot, basically.
Yeah, actually, Kelly was partially responsible. Walt Kelly is actually partially responsible for helping topple McCarthy. He was a very brave cartoonist to do that too, because he was not like in the safest position of power, but he bravely stood up for this and satirized McCarthy in one of his characters, calling him Simple J Malarkey, who was this sort of wildcat who believed in actively suppressing people who are kind of that he felt were not appropriate to his particular moral standard. That was actually one of the reasons why I liked Kelly a lot, is because I considered him to be an amazingly brave man. And I liked the fact that he actually stood up for stuff. There's some stuff in his comics that is a little archaic. Like, for example, there's not a lot of very notable female characters. Most of the characters are male. But there's a couple of them that are kind of interesting, like Ms. Beaver, who is the best football player the swamp has. She's probably the strongest character in the entire swamp physically, even stronger than Albert the alligator, who's like double her size. And there was also like a Rhode Island red hen who was very, very sports oriented. So there was a lot of interesting female characters, but they were kind of sideline characters. It was mostly a sort of a boys room kind of place. But it's just kind of from the era it was from. I think Kelly was the first one to I think he either voted for or supported a female president for the Cartoonists Association at a certain point. But I mean, he was a very progressive man. I've always kind of looked up to him for that.
He certainly made sure he got things. He was certainly, out there. More, he wanted to do more than just make his mark from what he did.
No, he was a bit of a firebrand. He kind of legendarily got in fights with Chuck Jones over the production of the Pogo special birthday special, it was called. And Jones wanted to do it a certain way, and Kelly wanted to do it a certain way, and they thought they'd ironed it out, but Jones apparently went behind Kelly's back and changed it around, and so Kelly claimed, and Kelly wanted to murder him, if not sue him. I mean, it was just like...
It was that bad.
It was that bad. I mean, there were people cringing away from both Chuck Jones and Kelly because they loved both of them and hated to see the two fighting, and it was just a nightmare for them because they respected both of them, but it was clear that they both hated each other at that point. In theory, I think both of them were probably very strong egos. Chuck Jones I've seen a couple of his discussions, and he kind of had a sort of Chuck Jones knows best attitude about some things. Kelly also was a strong-willed person too. I mean, ultimately, Kelly went on to try to animate his own cartoon, but essentially became ill and passed away before it could be finished. There's some remnants of it, and they're kind of gorgeous color pencil animated stuff. I mean, if anything I can say, I mean, even though I'm not really talking about my comic, I really do wish people would continue to, be aware of these particular cartoonists who we owe a fairly great debt to, both artistically and socially. And if there's one thing I can do, one of the reasons why I wanted to do my comic is I felt like people were forgetting it. And it's just, it's not in front of people. It's not like Disney stuff. Mickey Mouse, you can't get away from the guy. Whether you like him or hate him, you can't really escape the guy.
Nope.
You can't escape anything that Disney has.
They're pretty much everywhere now.
And stuff like Kelly, who doesn't have a corporation keeping his legacy alive, it's basically just like a couple of members of his family. When his wife passed away in 2009, that was pretty much the last really strong vestige of maintaining people's awareness of Walt Kelly's legacy when it went with him then. Because Selby Kelly was like the last person to really, strongly try to keep his memory alive. Still Carolyn Kelly, who's his daughter. I occasionally see, I think she's managing his Fantagraphics 12. There's supposed to be a 12-volume set of reprints of all of his comics chronologically in the newspaper. There's going to be a 12-volume set from Fantagraphics, and she's editing it and keeping track of that with a bunch of other people to kind of museumize his work. I think they're up to book 3 now, or either it's coming or it's coming out, or it has come out. Unfortunately, it's very hard to get this stuff in front of people because there's no reason for anybody to want to forward it. I mean, everybody wants to forward their stuff instead, understandably. There's a lot of competition like that. I mean, there's only so much money going out there, and you want to make somebody happy before somebody else makes them happy, so they can get their money, kind of a thing. Mm-hmm. But there's a lot of really good work out there that's kind of forgotten. It's amazing stuff, and it makes me kind of sad to see people having no concept of what was out there before, just simply because there's no impetus for it to be put in front of these people. And at least in the early days of the internet, there was a certain amount of like curational, check out this stuff that I've seen, but more and more it's starting to lean towards people just being paid to put this stuff in front of people. The computer games industry has been kind of, the gaming press of the internet has been kind of branded with basically being nothing more than a money-based propaganda machine for most other games.
Yeah, all of the AAA stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to get anybody's attention on. In a journalistic sense, people just aren't doing the job anymore. They're not telling people the news anymore from a sense of like, these are the facts. They're telling them, well, who paid me the most to tell them this particular truth?
Yeah, and you actually had some trouble with this, didn't you, in regards to the game that you published on Steam?
It was, in all fairness, it was touched by a couple of small indie game reviewers. The game press wasn't interested in it. Wikipedia refused to post an article on it, despite the fact of the fact that the game actually did have a notable feature. It was the first video game that was it was the first VR video arcade cabinet that was not a remake of a previously existing cabinet. In other words, it was basically the first ever original video arcade cabinet in VR.
Which is definitely impressive.
I mean, it's a definite sort of sort of a Guinness Books level kind of thing.
It is.
But the press didn't bother; they weren't interested because there wasn't anybody. It was Wikipedia's thing was nobody's talked about it that's notable, so it doesn't exist, and that's kind of how Wikipedia works. It has to be covered by somebody in the press. Well, it's kind of a catch-22. It won't be covered by the press unless somebody covers it. It's in sort of an incestuous relationship here. And there's a lot of that. There's a lot of that problem going on nowadays. Don't get to see stuff because somebody who isn't in the know isn't bothering to tell anything to anybody. It's like
because everyone's lazy nowadays.
Well, they want money for it. It's simple enough. They want to be paid because it's not about journalistic integrity. It's about who greases my wheels with enough cash so that I can spend my time writing this article about this thing. It's less, it's not about truth. It's about who paid the most amount of money for this particular truth. Someone actually once said that that we're living, how they have say there's the rocket age or the modern age and the postmodern age. They're going to say that this particular time is going to be referred to as the post-factual age.
Do you think that might apply to art too? The whole, problem with journalism?
I think in all fairness, pretty much everything journalistic is more or less a question of who's greasing the wheels at this stage. There's a lot of that, I think. I think we're kind of, there is a certain amount of like, what's the thing that sells the most advertisement? Yeah. News is entertainment. There's a lot of science fiction stuff that have been kind of saying that we've been threatening to get close to this. Max Headroom and RoboCop is a very good example of 80s era warnings about this, and I think we've actually made it to this stage where people are basically being sold news as entertainment.
Yeah, greasing the palms.
Yeah, I don't think there's really anybody really doing their job to actually there's very little journalistic integrity. In fact, I remember that the real thing that was interesting was the bit about gaming integrity is that there were people looking to I think there was an attempt by mainstream news organizations to see if they could bring in video game journalists, but they declined on the take. So they didn't actually invest in any of the actual, all the video game media, news agencies that you see online have been resoundingly rejected by mainstream news organizations. None of them were considered good enough. It's kind of funny when you think about it. I forget exactly when this was. I think this was about 5 years ago, something like that.
Yeah,
They couldn't find anybody journalistically integral to pick up the games market. So,
I mean, gaming has definitely much more of a presence on the internet than it does, mainstream.
well, yeah, it's an internet thing, and the internet is its own small little world of politics as well. It used to not be that way. I mean, I don't want to be like the old person saying, "Oh, I remember the golden age." I really do miss the internet back when it was primarily edus, .edus. I really do miss. I enjoyed the early '90s. I enjoyed the late 2000s of the internet, but I think around the mid 2000s, I kind of felt like we started to really lose the spark, and probably by the late 2000s, it was over, or it was falling apart very, very clearly.
I mean, that's just how it is. It's how it's always been. Probably how it is going to be for quite a while. Journalism is kind of a...
The internet's basically turned into broadcast television Mark II again.
Yeah.
I mean, it's fallen into the hands of media conglomerates, and it's so hard to find people to, like I said, the comic that I worked on 10 years ago, I saw 10 times more unique hits with that one in an internet that was a tenth the size. I don't believe that comic was necessarily better than the one I'm doing. So essentially, we're looking at 100-fold difference in reach based off the number of people on the internet and how many people are actually able to see content. And we've kind of, I think part of it has to do with the fact that the internet's a much more threatening place because there's all sorts of sites are kind of like, you don't go to a dying DNS site anymore. You used to be able to no one would complain about that. But nowadays, everyone's really suspicious about anything but the mainstream rubber-stamped official sites of things. There's not a lot of exploration in the far corners like they used to.
All right, well, switching tracks just for a second.
Sure. Really, that's not a... Yeah, it's really off on its own little tangent.
It is. But you've obviously gotten inspiration from tons of artists throughout time, from the 40s all the way up to the 80s. And those times were definitely very different to what they were now, and especially in terms of portrayal in animation. Were there any issues that you had with, anything controversial or anything of the like that you had problems with when you first started out doing the comic, or when you wanted to do the comic, as well as any problems that you still face today?
It is actually interesting that to some degree, some things that were acceptable back in the 40s and 30s and whatnot are no longer socially acceptable or less socially acceptable now. The ones that come immediately to mind are obviously portrayals that deal with racism or sexism. But that's actually not the problems I've been having, though I did have I remember there was a comment at one point in time on Tumblr where somebody was referring to the Gators' dialectic conversation as being somehow racially derogatory because it was sort of suggestive of black English. It's actually Gullah, which is a southern coastal dialect. It is primarily spoken by blacks, but it's actually kind of spoken by everybody on the coast. It's kind of, you see it from Louisiana all the way to Carolina along the shores.
Yeah, I guess what you're saying. It's like a little history lesson going into it.
Yeah, I mean, the Gator speaks in what I consider to be an appropriate dialect for his species and his location. And it's not really meant to make the Gator, specifically say, well, is the Gator a minority? Or it's no, it's not really meant to be a sort of a black white issue here. But it did get some people triggered on it, saying whoa, this Gator is talking in a black English. Is he a black metaphor or something like that? And I'm like, well, he's neither, really.
Oh God, we gotta be politically correct.
But the funny thing is that the thing that kind of surprised me most was just the whole concept of the character, the whole Gator devouring stuff. I never realized that people actually find that alarming now. That there's actually a subgroup of people that find the whole concept of the cartoon devouring thing to be somehow alarming. I never realized that there was actually that had actually kind of backslid. That since time immemorial, cartoon characters have been devouring cartoon characters, but apparently now it's kind of a thing that alarms people.
Anything can alarm people nowadays.
I don't know. I guess that nowadays it's like I think that a lot of cartoon characters from the past were kind of intended to be a bit of a subversive parable of something. Like if you look at Tex Avery cartoons, the cartoon wolf is like going through all sorts of all sorts of poses and gyrations that are suggestive of sexual content. And despite the fact that the cartoons are G-rated, they're kind of like suggestive cartoons because of the sort of like, oh, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. We know what's actually going on here. So that stuff has always been kind of built into cartoons. It seems like there's this sort of neo-Puritanism that's running through certain segments of the population where they're weirdly hypersensitive about certain cartoon shenanigans that used to be just treated as cartoon shenanigans are now considered triggers. Something.
It's kind of ridiculous nowadays.
I don't really, because I have a historical background and I've seen cartoons. I mean, if I didn't know anything about the past of animation and the kind of things that occurred, if I didn't have that, I would feel intimidated by people's responses when they do that. But now I kind of I kind of realized from day one when I started noticing people, saying this stuff is weird kind of thing. I'm like, these people are ignorant of cartoon history. They don't know what they don't know what they're talking about because this stuff's been there for ages. And to suddenly think that this is somehow strange, despite having 50, 60, 70 years of culture,
of the same thing
where nothing has nothing is different, nothing is changing it. Now this is a problem. I mean, I can kind of understand it.
There's like alarm bells ringing for me right there. It's like, hey, you were okay with this for so many years, and all of a sudden it's now.
Yeah, exactly. This is clearly a sign that this is in your head, not something that's my problem.
Yeah, it's in interpretation of the people reading it, because everyone's different naturally, and some people will get undertones from things that don't normally have undertones, and then they'll have a problem with that. And
I think the thing that bothers me most about some of these movements is that they're offended by the fact that people somehow get like an undertone, a joy out of the undertones of it. And it's like, you're just offended that these people are somehow happy about this stuff. You're just offended that people are enjoying themselves, aren't you? And I think there is a lot of that kind of a killjoy spirit that tends to roll through people, where it's like if somebody's having fun and it's not the kind of fun that they like, they don't want to see.
I think that's a good part right there. That there are people out there that's like, oh, let's ruin the fun on many of these people.
Yeah, I mean, they're just offended somebody else could be enjoying themselves in a different way that's different than they are.
Yeah,
or they just want to continue making other people's lives misery.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a powerful influence in human nature to be a killjoy. Don't underestimate the power of people to be a killjoy. Some people are mean just simply because they enjoy being mean to other people. They might not even have a rational reason for it. Like I said, the only places, like I said, that I've seen is there's a little bit of awkwardness over the fact that I was depicting a heavy dialectic character that is assumed to have been potentially an ethnic stereotype. But that kind of disappeared pretty quickly because I don't think anybody really cared, especially considering I grew up in the region in question, and it wasn't like I was exploiting some archetype. This was something that I lived with, that I knew. I mean, I don't have a Southern accent because I grew up on mostly Midwestern programming, newscasting, and I didn't really socially fit in with people in the South for the most part. And most of the people that lived in the neighborhood I lived in were transient military folks. So I didn't actually pick up a Southern accent because most of the people I talked to weren't really from the area, or I picked up most of my stuff from watching a lot of television there.
Was there anything in that vein, trouble or anything like that you might wish you could have changed, or anything in particular to the comic that you wish you could have changed about the time that you were making it, or any details or any particular thing that pertained to actually making it?
Not really. I've actually been quite happy with how it's turned out. Well, really, the only way to judge a work is by its ending. We'll have to. You might want to ask me that question when I hit around the 364 or 5 range, when the newspaper comic I'm planning on converting over to either a comic book format or a different kind of format. I'm going to leave the newspaper format in another 9 strips, mostly because I don't really. I kind of feel that the newspaper format, as much as I enjoy it, is more or less, I did this as almost a demi-religious tribute to the old styles, but I would like to move on and do something else with it. And I think I probably will change out, try explore other formats and other methods. But as for the actual development of the comic, what do I wish I'd done differently? I do think I probably over detailed the characters. The line mileage on the gate alone is ridiculous. I mean, he has so many scoots, 6 rows at some points, each with its own hatching. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I mean, but I really overdid it. But then again, I was kind of trying to emulate that sort of ridiculously maximalist sort of view of art back from that time. And they really, really went all out, especially Kelly. Kelly was known for what I've nicknamed tree porn, where he would just draw these ridiculously fancy, swampy landscapes that were so gorgeous. Many people nowadays, the thing that sticks with them most about Kelly's work is his ornate, intricate, beautiful, fanciful, swampy wonderlands that he would draw. People don't even really remember the characters as much as they do the ridiculous background detail he put into it. Of course, part of the reason why that happened is because he had a lot of helpers. He had somebody do fonting and had people inking towards the end of his career. See, that was one of the biggest mistakes I made when I was using Kelly as an example, is in his early work, yes, he did it himself. But I made the mistake, the hilarious mistake of assuming that 1970s era Kelly in all his glory, with ridiculous art and coloring and detail, he did that all himself. On rare occasions, he did, but for the most part, he had 2 very, very adept helpers. And so I was trying to emulate a man that basically was a team of 3 people. Talk about starting your bar higher. I mean, that's the reason why I never moved to an actual 7 days a week comic with this, because it was physically impossible.
Yeah, and you've been doing it mostly on your own, haven't you? Apart from a couple isolated examples or projects.
Now, like I said, there is actually one character that I allowed somebody else to draw, a minor character, in a couple of strips. I don't know how many couples, but I have to count, because they're really, really good at it. Though I'm very, very fine at drawing it myself, I kind of wanted them to do it because they're really good at this particular thing. But yeah, 99% of the comics have been done by me. Just like I said, for the exception of a single character, and I've actually drawn that character a couple of times with the help of this person. But yeah, this whole thing's been pretty much been me. Kind of regretful that I didn't actually farm out some of the content, but it was meant to be sort of a self-flagellating thing. I was punishing myself.
Yeah, you've been doing this comic for quite some time, haven't you?
2.5 years now,
Yep,
I'd say.
2.5 years.
May 5th on 2014, I think. I think that was when it started. May 5th, 2014. I did basically 2 strips a day. 2 strips a week. So basically, I do like a full week of comics. I mean, they're literally dated to a particular time frame. The first comic starts on May 5th, 1980, and it's been moving at 1 day each comic, as if it were actually moving in time at that rate, even though it's taken me a lot longer to generate them. So it's been like 272 days as of this. The current comic I'm working on is 273. It's a Sunday coming up here. Those take about 3 solid days to do, usually. The strips, wow. I can usually knock out a regular comic strip in a day, straight. If I work on it straight through the entire day, it usually takes me about 8-12 hours to do 1 strip. I've learned over time. One of the things I have learned over corners and what doesn't matter, and that is literally 90% of your success as a comic artist is knowing what not to draw. That is the biggest thing to learn, is knowing where you can cut content. Like, for example, you don't have to draw the background in every single panel. You set up if their characters are moving through space, yes, you do want to lay out where they're moving to and where they're at. But all you have to do is really draw the background in the first panel and the second panel and just kind of embellish vague details. In fact, a lot of the things I learned when I was learning from Kelly's work is that he didn't actually draw a lot of backgrounds in his daily strips. In fact, as much as 75% of the content of his strip was words. Some of those panels were absolutely chock full of words. He would pad the ever-living hell out of his strips with words because he was very prosaic. And that's really one of those lessons that it looks a lot harder than it actually is a lot of the time being a cartoonist. It's really learning where you stop drawing, when's good enough. That's really the key of being a good cartoonist. I know there's going to be a question, something about like how do you keep the pace, how you come up with the ideas and stuff like that. But just something I want to impart. One of my friends is actually a syndicated cartoonist. Her name is Dana Simpson. She does a comic strip known as Phoebe and her Unicorn, which people who are in the pony fandom may recognize this person, especially because of that fact.
I think so.
Yeah, so that Dana's somebody I've known since like her days as working on Ozzy and Millie. I've known her since like 1998, and she imparted a very valuable piece of information. And the thing is, when you're making comics and you're not really sure what you're doing that particular day, and you're not thinking the joke's particularly good, don't sweat it. There's another one tomorrow. And that really is the key to doing comics, is just don't worry about it. They're not all going to be great. They're all sometimes they're going to suck. Sometimes they're not going to be the best thing you ever came up with. And don't beat yourself up about it. The key here is consistency and just coming out with it. Meet your deadlines. And really setting your own deadlines is really the key to getting it. I mean, I'm very happy to say I have never missed a deadline on any of my comics. I've done 272 of the darn things, and I have never missed a deadline. They've always come out on time. The closest I've cut it is 10 minutes, though.
You have to impose some sort of discipline if you're going to be so dedicated to an art, aren't you?
Set times for yourself. You'll find out how much better it is if you set a particular strict deadline for yourself to get something done and just treat it as being deadly serious, that it's life or death, even though it isn't, and you will get it done. Another big help towards being an artist that I've learned is that a fairly recent invention of art streaming is extremely valuable, because drawing is a very lonely thing. And nobody wants to sit there in a room by themselves with a pencil sketching stuff. I mean, sure, you enter your own world, but it gets kind of boring without any kind of input or response from anybody.
Yeah, there's a kind of group. It's like a group, kind of a whole group thing. It's like performing a show or something for a group of people. There's that interaction that makes it so much more engaging to what you're doing, as well as you can fully interact with people. That you can talk to anyone in the stream. You can show them something you want to do or explain something.
Best of all, you can get live input on the jokes.
Yeah,
that's the best part, especially as a cartoon.
That's the best. That is true. Yeah, you get I suppose a live critique.
Yeah, I mean, you can sometimes, like, if you're especially brazen, you can go and ask for opinions on what's the best permutation of a joke, or if they have any ideas, and people give you input. There've been a couple of regulars in my streams, chat with them, and at least I'd say 10 strips have been inspired, if not maybe 20 or 30 have been inspired by ideas that people forwarded in chat. I'm trying to remember a particular example, but I know, like, the current one I'm working on, one person suggested that when the gator throws the bouquet, and that there's this moment where the gator is throwing a bouquet at a wedding, and that the idea would that the person that gets the bouquet actually gets devoured by the gator in question who threw the bouquet, due to the misinterpretation that the person that gets the bouquet becomes a bride next, whereas the gator was thinking becomes a part of the bride.
That is very much like him.
Yeah, it's a messed up kind of way of thinking of it, but yes, that's sort of the kind of jokes that thrown around. He said that'd be a good idea. I said, yeah, I like that. Though usually I must admit, it's kind of tiring coming up with jokes that are of a particular stylistic ilk, like the devouring jokes. I can't believe I've gotten as many of them out of that I have. It is funny. There is a lot of mileage to be had comedy-wise out of cartoon devouring. I'm really surprised that there's as much as it has been. I'll be honest with you, I kind of find it tiring. I mean, it's weird to hear me say that Gonechoo, a strip that's clearly got that as its primary motif, it's really not, in my opinion, it's really not about those jokes. That's just kind of one of the hilarious, like, additional mileage motifs that come out of it.
Yeah, particularly, I think it was the 2014, either 2014 or 2015 Christmas, like Christmas bit that you did, just the face that he made, whilst also having having his friend's feet sticking out of his mouth was something that made me laugh.
Oh yeah,
that was
actually that particular thing was actually, even though the comic strip exists supposedly from the 1980s, there's occasional plausibly deniable anachronistic winks, but that particular pose was actually a parody of the Tumblr Christmas Raptor. Christmas, Merry Christmas. Whereas the raptor's got the tongue sticking out and is just kind of standing there, and then it zooms in and the eyes get even more the pupils get even more dilated. It says Merry Christmas, and it's like I thought that'd be funny to do an alligator version of that particular scene and just have like the alligator look like he's tripping out on eggnog or something, like just totally full of the joy of Christmas. I don't know what the heck was going. I don't know what the heck is the basis of the original. What the reasoning is behind the
tripping out on Otter.
The Merry Christmas Raptor thing. I don't know where that came from, but I thought it was great, so I kind of invented that, and then I eventually utilized the joke as a part of the Christmas Eve joke with the gator all like ridiculously tripped out kind of an expression. It's one of the things I've learned a lot of is like doing hilarious cartoon expressions. You slowly pick up these little details. My favorite actual expressions are on the otter, especially when the otter gets these wonderful, hateful, and loathing expressions. The otter's just full of these. I mean, you're so used to like cartoon animals being kind of adorable and cute all the time, and a lot of Kelly's characters tend to be adorable and cute a lot. During the 90s, a lot of Calvin and Hobbes kind of stuff, Bill Watterson would do a lot of these really hilariously distorted expressions on the kid, Calvin. He'd always, squinch up his face in this horrible, gnarly fashion. And it's like, I kind of picked up a little bit of that on the otter, that whenever the otter is displeased with something, he'll have some absolutely hilarious negative faces, just, annoyed looking expressions. Like when the gator's saying something incredibly stupid or being annoying. This is a moment in a Saturday strip where the otter is telling him that he's not really having a good time at school, and the gator just says, "But school be fun," and the otter's just giving him this like, "You do not understand what it's like." Just like, you come from a time where people would stand out in the middle of the field with a blackboard and draw stick figures on it all day and call that education. He doesn't actually say that, but that's what he's thinking.
There's so much character you can derive from that. You can get so much out of it, and you can get so much more for such a long period of time. It's as long as you still have that inspiration, and as long as you have that desire and that sense of humor that you have, you can do some great things with this medium for quite some time.
I think the key for doing comic strip style artwork is limiting the spectrum of your characters to what the people are there for. Some people have occasionally said to me that they kind of wish that there were more characters involved in the strip. There really are a lot, actually, if you look for them, but they're not really the mainstay characters. Most of the added characters are usually in dream sequences, or they're like part of the imagination of either the otter. 90% of the time, except for like 3 other characters, are confirmed to be. Well, actually, no. I guess there's also the Bourbonite characters, but they don't really count as being living beings. But there's like the otter's mother and father are essentially silhouettes. That's usually the moment where I really make a fan. Is the moment where they realize that this isn't simply Walt Kelly's cute little comforting let's have funny animals. Kind of, there is a darker side to the strip. There's no question about that. Exactly what depth the darkness goes, I will say that I will not violate the original rating of the comic in these, but there is some very dark places the comic actually does go. The one that usually the moment that most people usually know something's very, very different about this comic, and it's not just simply a what's the word for it, an escapist piece of, that's there just simply to make you happy and give you escapism. I mean, it mostly is a very happy place, because the Otter and Gator are trying to kind of be friends and have a good time with life as best as they can, but there is darkness in actually both of their lives, though you don't really see what's going on with the Otters until much later. You don't get doesn't have any friends until much later. But you kind of find out a bit about the Gator's broken memories of things by strip number 14.
Yeah.
There's a lot of little subtle cues that I use in the strip to imply things. Even the shading is a messenger. The use of color is a messenger. If you see color in the strip, it means it's probably a dream sequence or something embellished a bit with imagination, especially if it's positive, but not always. The hatching that I use tells you some places, gives you cues about the environment that they're in. Like, for example, if you see linear hatching, it means they're in the forest. Both characters use linear hatching themselves. In the Otter's suburb and in the school, it's all zip tones, the halftones, little dot halftones that you see in like old style black and white newspaper photos. And there's every so often, very rarely, there's, not to alarm anybody, but the comic is full of all sorts of subtle, symbolic, hidden meanings all over the place. Mm-hmm. I mean, most of it won't make any sense until years later. But there's a lot of like stuff that's precursoring to later works I'm planning. And you won't know until I've gotten to that stage, and you'll finally go, that's what that was years later.
Yeah.
It's fun to do that. I picked up a lot of that from my appreciation of like Andrew Husse's Homestuck, kind of like laying the groundwork and involving people in. I mean, Hussey, however you feel about Homestuck, does have some masterful storytelling there. And he does know how to please an audience. You have to grant him that.
Yeah, playing the long game.
Play the long game. It's really hard to do on the internet because everybody's always reacting very strongly to the immediate stuff. I mean, a lot of people on the internet make a terrible mistake and they judge a work by its earlier parts. I've had comments from people saying, oh, this comic is just this particular thing. And I'm like going, you're going to look so stupid when I'm done with this comic. And I feel so sorry for you because that's on the internet forever. You have to live with saying that. Do your best not to say that about a work that isn't finished. When a work is finished and you do a rational cataloging what's going into it, that's fine. But if you're dumb enough to actually say something about an unfinished work that's still in progress, then you have to live with the fact that you jumped the gun and said something dumb about something before it was done. The internet never forgets.
I just have one more thing. Obviously, going on through, you've obviously had plenty of experience doing this, and with art in general. Is there anything that you might want to say, or any advice that you might want to give for any aspiring artists that might want to do anything similar to yours, or any?
Never let anybody tell you what not to do content-wise. Draw what you like. I mean, even if it's, I'll be frank, even if you're just drawing porn, draw porn, damn it. I mean, you've got to have a reason to draw.
I know one artist I know because she and I had a little falling out lately. But from what I can understand is that she has a hard time drawing porn, basically.
I mean, if you don't want to draw it, that's fine. The question is, if you have your trouble and you're saying, I don't know what to draw the stuff you like, for goodness sake. Surely there's something you enjoy drawing.
Yeah, pretty much.
Don't kick yourself over the fact you're not producing something that you consider for public view. That's fine. I'm just saying that the key here is to draw. That's the important thing.
As long as you just get to it and put the practice in, put your thoughts down on paper, put your passions down on paper.
Right. I mean, another important thing is, like I said, don't let other people tell you what to do. Take critiques and whatnot, but I'm saying content-wise, just choose what you want to draw and draw it. People change over time anyway. I mean, it's not a big thing. I mean, I imagine in another 2-3 years, I might be drawing the gator and otter. Might be even pretty radically different. Who knows? Thing is that you need to follow what keeps your flame going. Too many people self-censor. Too many people will go, oh, what are other people looking for? Don't think about that. Just work on what pleases you. You got to work for what pleases you. And that's kind of what I did. Was I literally stepped back and I thought to myself, I really miss this type of, funny animal type of character, and I want to draw this stuff because I never see it anymore. I mean,
I think another thing I would like to point out is that at some point it's just like, the commissions, the money and such. It's like, if you worry about that, then perhaps, because sometimes commission brings out some very interesting ways you can try out to do,
Well, I mean, that's some people do. I've run across artists that do request streams, and they do them not necessarily to please crowds, but to challenge themselves artistically to draw new things. And they just like say something, like tell me what you want me to draw, and they'll draw it, and they'll learn. I've seen a couple of really good artists that have become good artists because they blow stuff out at an incredibly fast speed. That's the other thing, of course, learning really good cartooning is knowing, like hitting your lines fast. And, it's actually more trouble. You actually lose more time erasing than throwing it out and starting over in some cases with real cartooning. With real cartooning, it should actually be more trouble to erase your mistakes than it is to start over and tune it again. In real cartooning. Yeah, I mean, that's part of like growing artistically is you get to play around with ideas. Like, for example, before I did Gonechoo, I don't, as weird as this sounds, especially considering my background, I've never actually drawn an alligator. I drew lizards, but I never actually drew an alligator. And there is some subtle facial differences between a lizard and an alligator. They have more frog-like mouths, especially the cartoon ones. They're actually like a frog with a pair of pliers attached to its face is actually closer to what an alligator is shaped like than, say, a reptile lizard style or a snake. They have very, very expansive kind of, their mouths are very, very expansive to the sides as well as to the front. It's like it's funny what you'll run across that you've never drawn before. Or I never drew an elephant or a hippo. I got a bunch of funny animal character types that I'd never drawn before, and now I've actually gotten some experience on it. 2 days ago, I drew my first beaver.
You can take that what you will.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything.
We've learnt a lot. We've definitely been say this non-sarcastic, it's been an amazing discussion. So much insight into the history of animation, and as well as comics and such. It's some of the pieces that are lost, like you said before, either lost or censored or just aren't archived in the way that they need to, and it's sadly it's such a dying medium that it's people are starting to get lost less and less. They don't see it as much. They don't get as much exposure as they used to, and it is a big shame because these people, like these artists, they were like the forefathers of what we used to do today, or what we do today. And like you said, we wouldn't have the mediums that we have today without the immense work and the immense effort that they put into their work, and that they definitely did put immense effort into their work because they did everything frame by frame, or they did everything by hand on a piece of paper, and didn't have paint tool Sai or whatever, or flash based animation. It really goes without saying that these people need to get shown the appreciation they deserve. If there's nothing else, I think it would be a good idea if we ended it here. We have been going on for an hour and 35 minutes.
Probably could go on forever, to be honest with you.
Oh,
I do a lot of streams, and I fill the streams with all sorts of rambling.
I'm sure.
Absolutely.
We got the small taste from here today, but I'd like to thank you for coming on here. It's definitely been an amazing, I learned so much. I loved it. It's been great speaking with you, and it's been great, getting your experience and getting your 2 cents on what you like, and getting to know you and getting to know the work that you do. And we will post his Tumblr account as well as his streaming. Before we finish, is there anything else that anyone might want to add? Any little quick tidbits?
Shouldn't we all promote our stuff?
Yeah.
I think so.
Gonechoo, where can everyone find your work?
I do believe that I still have a direct from www.gonechoo.com. That's Gonechoo, and that will go to the Tumblr. If you do a search for the word Gonechoo, you'll probably stumble on the Steam game. We didn't even get into the discussion about the Steam game very much, but yes, it does exist. It is a simulated arcade game, and you can probably find that on by just doing the search that way. And Gonechoo. There you go.
There you can find almost every piece of art he's done so far. All of how many strips now?
I'm working on 273. Like I said, I plan on changing formats around 364, 65, a year, basically a full year cycle, and then I'm going to try to do something a little different.
If you want to check out Anthro Talent's Tumblr, we will be favoriting and reblogging the Gonechoo comic. Also, check out our YouTube channel.
This has been In the Spotlight with myself, Diamond Heart, and the very esteemed Gonechoo, which I would like to thank for his time coming out here and speaking to us and giving us so much good information, so much insight to the work that he does and the things that he's trying to honor.
Well, it was a pleasure being on. I appreciate you having me over.
Thank you for watching.